Greetings, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the final session of our two-day conference, The Vote, Reimagining What It Could Be. I'm Deondra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. And it has been an absolute pleasure to be a part of the discussions that have gone on over the last 2 days. We've heard from student researchers, from activists, from innovators, from political professionals, all who have helped us to think really big about democratic citizenship and the aspiration of a more equitable democracy, and how we can promote universal voter participation. The purpose behind organizing this series of events was to take a little time out in the midst of a pretty messy campaign season, one that's pretty intense, to think a bit bigger and to reflect on the meaning of democracy and what it requires. I have to say it is a distinct privilege to introduce to you our keynote speaker in this final finale event. Professor Guy Charles from Duke University Law School is the Edward and Ellen Schwarzman Professor of Law here at Duke University. He is the co-director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He teaches and writes about constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics, and race. In 2016, he received the law school's Distinguished Teaching Award. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard, Berkeley, Georgetown, Virginia, and Columbia Law Schools. Professor Charles received his JD from the University of Michigan Law School and clerked for the Honorable Judge Damon Keith of the United States Courts of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. While at the University of Michigan, he was among a group of students who founded the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, and he served as the journal's very first editor-in-chief. Professor Charles, welcome to this keynote event. Thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of our event. We're excited to learn from you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for having me. It is a distinctive pleasure for me to be here this afternoon, and I am very much looking forward to engaging with everyone this evening. So I have 3 points that I want to make, and maybe a fourth. And the title of my talk this evening is America's Broken Election System. And the 3.5 points I'd like to make is that the American election system is broken. So that's point number one. Second, it needs a radical overhaul. Third, it is up to us to fix it. And then maybe a fourth, maybe 3.5, fixing it will be really, really hard. The New York Times has called the 2020 election cycle the most litigated election ever. Over 300 lawsuits have been filed so far, and we are still a few weeks before Election Day itself. Bloomberg had a headline recently in which it said, everybody is suing everybody. In some respects, and here's something for you all to think about, we have two elections. We have one that has already started, that is taking place at the ballot box, and then we have another one that is taking place in the courthouse. In fact, just today, in a case called Democratic National Committee versus Bosselman, a panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit reversed the decision of a lower federal court in which the lower federal court had extended some voting deadlines. The appellate court offered 2 reasons for reversing the district court's decision. The first is that a federal judge should not change election rules so close to election day. And then secondly, if election rules ought to be changed, that's a decision that belongs to the legislature and not to a court. The lower federal court was dealing with a problem that has manifested itself in many many contexts, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic. It extended the deadline for online and mail-in voting registrations by a week. It extended the deadline for the receipt of mail ballots from November 3rd to November 9th, provided that the ballots are postmarked by the 3rd. In the Seventh Circuit, the appellate court concluded that the lower court just didn't have the authority to do so. This Seventh Circuit's decision comes on the heels of a decision by the United States Supreme Court, which reversed a different court in South Carolina that had held that South Carolina voters did not need to provide a witness signature to cast a ballot. And the Supreme Court reversed that decision, essentially saying the same thing, that lower courts just don't have the authority, though it didn't really provide a real rationale, but the fundamental rationale we could extract is that lower courts did not have the authority to change rules this close to an election. What I think this pandemic is pointing out, what it is revealing, is not just the fact that we rely upon litigation to address a number of our election issues, but that our election process is fundamentally flawed and broken, and that if we want a better democracy, we have to fix it. So the question is, why is it fundamentally flawed? And what I want to do with the remainder of my time is to provide some of the structural constitutional reasons why it is fundamentally flawed and why we need to fix it. Before beginning, I want you to think about the fact that what we really have in many respects is an election system that was designed for a 19th century, 18th century, but at best 19th century world, not even a 20th century world, and certainly not a 21st century world. So imagine that we were operating within a transportation system that was designed for the 18th century, the 19th century. And now we're in the 21st century and we're having to use the same fundamental framework of that system. That's essentially what we have with respect to an election, to our election system. So now let's run through some of the most fundamental characteristics. And as a lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, I'm going to focus on the constitutional framework and the legal rules that determine and constrain our election system. I think too often we think about election questions and election issues, but we don't recognize the role that law, especially the American Constitution and constitutional law, plays in defining, constraining, determining our electoral system. All right, so here's my first point. Unlike most other countries, and certainly most other democracies, the United States Constitution does not explicitly contain a right to vote. This is a point that I often make because people don't recognize that they actually don't have within the American Constitution a clause or a statement that's kind of similar to, for example, what we have with respect to the First Amendment. So if you look at the First Amendment of the Constitution, it provides that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, for example. And that amendment then tells us that speech is a freedom and a right that we have. It is fundamental, and that the government has to be very careful when it regulates our speech and in the speech context. Well, we don't have anything like that for voting. So consider as an example the South African Constitution. It provides every adult citizen has the right to vote in elections in any legislative body. You know, there's nothing equivalent to anything like that in the American Constitution. By contrast, our Constitution presupposes that there are certain federal offices that we will vote for. So it presupposes that we're going to vote for the House. And as many of you know, that until the 17th Amendment was passed, the senators were appointed and not elected. Now both senators and of course members of the House of Representatives are directly elected. But there's no provision in the Constitution, even with respect to those two offices, that says explicitly that citizens have a right to vote for those offices. The relevant clauses of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, with respect to the House, and the 17th Amendment with respect to the Senate, they provide electors of each state shall have the qualifications of electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So it presupposes that there are electors, And really what it says is whatever the definition, however the states define their electorate for the most numerous branch of their state legislature, those will be the same people who will elect members of the House and our senators. So it presupposes electors, but doesn't explicitly provide for a right to vote. What the Constitution does, most of it does, is provide what we can essentially call negative rights. Voting can't be denied, for example, on the basis of race. This is the 15th Amendment. It can't be denied on the basis of gender, and that's the 19th Amendment. It can't be denied on the basis of failure of paying a poll tax. That's the 24th Amendment. It can't be denied to individuals who are 18 years or older. That's the 26th Amendment. But again, it doesn't say that, hey, if you are a citizen, you are entitled to vote. And as many of you know, there is no federal right, there's no right at all to vote, no federal right to vote for president. We in the American system do not elect our president. We select the people who select our president. So Article 2, Section 1 and Clause 2 says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature may direct a number of electors. Now what that means is that we have an indirect process of selection that we refer to as the Electoral College, or better yet, the electoral colleges, because each state has its own method and process. And this means that voting in presidential elections, anyway, to the extent that it is a right that is provided by the state and subject to repeal by the state. So if the state of North Carolina, in which I find myself today, decides going forward that it is not going to allow voters to vote for the electors for president, then it doesn't have to. The Constitution doesn't require it to do so. And there have been times early on in American history in which electors, state legislatures simply appointed the electors. And of course, we know that some jurisdictions, such as Puerto Rico, so if you are a US citizen and you live in Puerto Rico, you actually can't even vote because Puerto Rico is not a state. So the state you can't even get that right. So as you may have in North Carolina or in other states where the state provides you with a right to vote for the electors. So Puerto Rican Americans who live in Puerto Rico don't even have a say in this process at all, even though they are American citizens. And of course, as many of you know as well, that with respect to the District of Columbia, they get a say in the presidential selection because of the 23rd Amendment, but no say with respect to senators and House of Representatives. So it's an interesting process, an interesting system in which you have a system in which people who are citizens actually don't have a right to vote for the highest office in the land. They may not, if you're a resident of DC and Puerto Rico, even have a say with respect to the House or the Senate. And there are no fundamental guarantees of that right. Now, this first point is simply an exemplar of a larger point, which is that our Constitution does not provide very many rules for the practice and conduct of American democracy. You'll be hard pressed to find in the Constitution the fundamental rules of how democracy and voting are to be conducted. And if we want to be uncharitable, we could say that our Constitution is very deficient in this respect. So if you want to understand how what some of the issues are in American democracy and how to begin to address them, this is one fundamental place to start. Now, there's a second interesting feature that I want to emphasize and highlight, which is that American democracy is highly decentralized. Now, one way to think about it is that it is a federal system, which means that there is some responsibility for elections and election rules at the state level, and then some responsibility at the federal level. But the fundamental reality, and the point that I want to underscore here, is that we depend upon the states to administer elections, including federal elections, and we depend upon the states to set the rules for elections, including federal elections. So if you want to know what the rules are for a federal election, what the laws are that govern, you have to look at the laws of the state in which you find yourself. There are very few federal rules and laws that regulate even federal elections. This system, this decentralized and federal system, is as a function of constitutional design. So Article 1, Clause 4 of the Constitution provides that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and for House of Representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So the Constitution provides the states with the initial responsibility. Now, the Constitution also provides, and that clause also says, that Congress may make or alter such regulations. So there's a division of authority between the states and the federal government. Or consider the 17th Amendment, which provides for the direct election of senators, as I mentioned. The amendment prescribes 2 senators for each state elected by the people thereof, and also provides that the electors in each state shall have the qualifications, and I've already mentioned that, for electors of the most numerous branch. The 17th Amendment simply copies the format of Article 1, Section 2 with respect to the House. Instead of prescribing different sets of rules of qualifications for federal electors, the qualifications are exactly the same as that of the state. So whatever the states decide for their electors, for who has the right to vote for the state, that's the same one that applies. So what we have is a system in which we depend upon the states for the rules of elections and the practice of elections. Relatedly, there's no central mechanism that administers federal elections. So unlike other advanced democracies, we don't have a central agency or entity that provides for uniform rules and practices when it comes to the administration of elections. So take, for example, the CDC, right? So we have, here's a federal agency that thinks about issues, Centers for Disease Control, issues related to disease, or you could think about the federal agencies with respect to health. You could think about the federal agencies with respect to transportation, right? The way that we have a lot of central federal agencies that address issues of national concern. We don't depend upon the states primarily for addressing those issues. We have a federal mechanism, a federal institution that provides rules, that provides guidelines, etc. But we don't have that really in the context of elections. Each state prescribes its own rules, which means not only do we have decentralization, but we also have heterogeneity. States do different things when it comes to elections, including federal elections. So some states have voter identification requirements, others don't. Some states have same-day registration, others don't. Some states permit felons to vote, others don't. What it means to be an American citizen voting in a federal election will differ and does differ from state to state. In fact, decentralization is so pervasive that the practice might differ from county to county and precinct to precinct. So county X in one state might use a particular voting machine, but county Y in the same state might use a different voting machine that might or might not be more or less user-friendly. So election law is a product of state law, even for federal elections, but it is even very decentralized so that what happens in one locality may be very different from another locality. So if you're trying to think about why, for example, we might have certain types of pathologies, why there might be voting long lines in one part of the state, but not in another part of the state, part of what we have to think about is how the process is so localized and so decentralized. There's a third distinction that I want to bring to the table, and it is essentially a function of the second. In almost all jurisdictions in the United States, elections are administered by partisan officials. That is, individuals who are members, excuse me, of a political party and are almost ideologically interested in making these decisions in the first instance. So take, for example, our state of North Carolina. Elections here are administered by the State Board of Elections. The board is composed of a chairperson, a secretary, and 3 members. The board is by design intended and designed to be bipartisan, not nonpartisan, but bipartisan. The chairperson is a Democrat, as is the secretary. 2 of the 3 members are Republican. Or take the Board of Elections for Durham County. It has 3 members, 2 are Democrats and 1 is a Republican. In light of the evident partisanship of those who promulgate election regulations and administer the rules, their partisan intent are always open to question. This is one of the reasons why we have so much litigation in this election process. We have a lot of litigation because people are questioning the role of the state legislature, the role of the election administrators, thinking that they are making rules that are advancing their partisan advantage as opposed to what is in the best interest of the electorate. Consider, for example, a recent controversy in Ohio with respect to polling hours for early voting. The Democrats accuse the Ohio Secretary of State, who's a Republican, of trying to repress democratic and turnout among voters of color by limiting early voting in urban areas, but maintaining longer hours in suburban areas. The secretary initially defended the move on the grounds of needs, but of course, his partisan foes disagreed. From their perspective, they thought that what the secretary was trying to do was minimize political participation by people from the other side of the aisle, right? By Democrats and people who tend to vote for Democrats. Well, one of the reasons why we have this dispute is because we have partisan administration of American elections, which do not make sense, right? So in many walks of our lives, we don't think partisanship is a relevant criterion. Imagine when you're selecting a doctor, you don't say, look, is this a Republican doctor or is this a Democratic doctor? We ask and we say, well, who is the best, most qualified person who can help me manage my health, right? We're not making those decisions on the basis of partisanship. And one question is whether we ought not be doing the same for election administration. Another feature, and an important one that is worth noting, is how much the American democratic practice depends upon private individuals for its implementation. So now I just talked about the fact that too many of our state individuals, too many of our states, people who are running the process are partisan. Now this particular point is the fact that we have too few professionals running the process. And many of us have experienced this when we go to either register to vote or when we go vote. The person who is helping us when we go vote, so many of those individuals are private volunteers. They tend to be retired, they tend to be older, with time on their hands, right? We have a lot of private individuals, private volunteers that help run our system, that our democracy depends quite a bit, quite frankly, on non-professionals. This is in contrast to many advanced democracies that rely, for example, let's take registration, rely upon the state to register voters, and the state bears that responsibility. But say in the American context, voter registration is really a function of private groups and individuals. The state's role is very passive. Or consider another example. In many democracies, the funding of elections is a responsibility of the state. But in our democracy, funding of campaigns is generally a responsibility of individuals. We pay to support people running for office. that could and might strike us as odd. Like, we literally are paying to support our candidate, as opposed to seeing public service as a function of a democracy, a public function of a democracy, right? Instead, if you want this person to run, whether they're in state judges, and our state judges are elected, or whether they're running for the state legislature, or whether they're running for federal office, right? It is the responsibility of the individual to finance the campaign of various sorts. That's just as an example of the role of private parties in the system. Private people are often responsible for disseminating information about voting. They're often responsible for taking people and getting them to the polling places, right? There's a lot in the process that the state does not take responsibility for, but that is handed off to private individuals. This then relates to another point that I want to make, which is the burden of political participation that is placed on the voter. Instead of the government taking responsibility for political participation, so for example, registering voters, we place a lot of responsibility on voters themselves, which creates a number of different types of opportunities for problems in the political process. I don't know if some of you were paying attention to this, but recently a report came out from Channel 4 that did a study and an investigation on misinformation about elections that was directed particularly towards the African American community in certain parts of the country. And one of the reasons why this thing and misinformation directed towards individuals can happen is because we impose a lot of burdens on individuals to learn about elections, to figure out what the timing is going to be, to register to vote, et cetera. And the government takes few of those responsibilities. So there are lots of places in the process for things to go wrong. And then we depend upon the judiciary and the courts as administrators and enforcers. Because we don't have a central mechanism for administering federal elections in particular, really litigation is the primary mechanism that we have for resolving voting disputes. And because we have so many different types of practices, we impose a lot of burdens on individuals, we depend upon private volunteers. There are a lot of ways in the process for things to go wrong. And of course, when you add something like in this current environment, a pandemic to it, and when you add polarization, and when you add closely divided and contested elections, it is then not surprising that we have two sets of elections, one that's taking place at the ballot box, and then the other one that's taking place in the courts. We use courts to resolve so much of our election disputes that really ought to be resolved by planning and thinking and having better election laws, processes, and mechanisms. So to reiterate some of these features, we have a constitutional system framework that does not provide a fundamental right. We have decentralization, federalism, but decentralization, deep reliance upon the states. We have partisan administration of the process. We have few professionals. We have burdens upon individuals. We have reliance upon the states. But to make matters worse, and this is a point that very few people think about, but I want to bring it to your attention, we use race and rely upon race as the mechanism for mediating through most of our election disputes. And here I want to pause and expand upon this point a little bit in a number of different directions. One of the fundamental fights that that we've had in the American context has been with respect to racial equality. All right, so we know this. We have a constitution that preserved the practice of slavery. We fought a civil war over the citizenship of African Americans with the ratification and passage of the 13th Amendment. From the end of Reconstruction through the 1960s, we fought both formal legal segregation as well as informal and illegal segregation. And really from the post-civil rights era through today, we've been wrestling with the inclusion of folks of color, especially African Americans, into the polity. And of course, one of the fights that we've had is with respect to voting, with the passage of the 15th Amendment and 1870, and then of course the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, what that has meant is that racial discrimination in voting has in fact been a central feature and a central fight of the American polity. If you look at the landscape of the American legal system, one of its outlines, strong outlines, will be racial discrimination. We intended to resolve that with the 15th Amendment that outlawed racial discrimination in voting, as well as the 14th Amendment that made racial discrimination, period, unconstitutional. But of course, those amendments, not too long after passage, or for a few years, they were enforced. But at the end of Reconstruction brought basically non-enforcement until the 65 Voting Rights Act with respect to voting. And the Voting Rights Act outlawed literacy tests in areas that use them as the mechanism for disenfranchising Black voters. So much of our fights in the United States around voting has actually been around race. And in many respects, the way that we have used race as the medium for thinking through a lot of our voting disputes. And so there are many, because of the social location, the racial inequality that we have in the American system, a lot of the voting problems that we have will have a disparate impact, and they do have a disparate impact on marginalized groups, specifically African Americans. So when a county implements, when a state implements a voter identification requirement, a photo voter identification requirement, it often has a disparate impact on marginalized groups, specifically on Black voters. When a state makes it harder for people to vote by having, say, onerous registration requirements, it often has an impact on marginalized groups, specifically African American voters. When a state prohibits ex-felons from voting, it often has a disparate impact. So many of our voting rules are not simply voting rules that can be onerous, to the extent they are onerous and problematic in and of themselves. That is also true, but we must also think about them against the background of race and the role that racial discrimination has played in our country, specifically racial discrimination in voting, and our attempt to address those questions and our attempt to provide remedies for those issues and those problems. Right? So I've outlined for you what I think are some of the central features of the American constitutional and legal system, its background assumptions, and why we have so many of the voting problems that we have. Now I want to spend the next few minutes before closing to think about where should we go from here. And as I said at the very beginning, I think our system is broken. That is, I think our system has worked not for everybody. I've talked about the African Americans in particular, and voters of color much more broadly. Our system has worked roughly for the last few hundred years, though not well for everyone. But currently we have a system that voting and election system that is badly in need of updating to address 21st century questions and 21st century problems. And there are a number of different reforms that are on the table that I think we ought to take very seriously. So we're in a presidential election cycle, so let me start there. One of the first reforms that people are starting to think about and starting to take very seriously is whether we should abolish the Electoral College and that we should amend the Constitution to assure that every citizen has a right to vote for president, and that right can be effectively exercised with minimal burden. That will begin to go a long way toward addressing the disparate burdens that the Electoral College system imposes. So here are some very easy examples. We are in the state of North Carolina. We happen to be in this period and moment a swing state, which means that we get a lot of attention through this time period. But there are lots of places in which that are not swing states. They don't get very much attention during the presidential election cycle. And some scholars, both political scientists and economists, have said that that voters in swing states, not only do they get more electoral attention, which some might not want, but they also get better public policy effects as a result of being voters that have to be courted by both parties and both sets, but not true for a vast portion of the country that is widely viewed under the Electoral College system as non-competitive. So that's one reform that is on the table that should be thought about, is what should we do about the Electoral College? Another reform that is on the table that people are thinking about is DC statehood. How should we think about the District of Columbia? And then additionally, how should we think about Puerto Rico? Both are places territories with American citizens, but without full participation rights, full representation rights. And the question for the 21st century, right? The core question for today is can we reconcile our concept of equal participation and our concept of equality with a practice in which American citizens are not given full and equal basic rights, right? Can those two things be reconciled? Maybe they could have been reconciled in the 19th century. Maybe they could have been reconciled in the 18th century when we had different conceptions of political participation. But today, I think there is an incongruity between the two ideas, between the idea of equality and then the reality of the lack of political participation and lack of fundamental rights. Right? So here are two major ideas that are on the table. There are also other types of reform ideas on the table that people can and ought to get behind. So one that I think is, here are a few of them that Congress the House has considered under the House Bill H.R. 1. The Democrats have passed, and depending on what happens in this upcoming election, might be front and center in both the House and in the Senate, are things like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, restoring voting rights to people who have a prior felony conviction, expanding early voting, and simplifying absentee voting. The bottom line here is twofold. One, we should make voting and political participation as easy as possible. And the second, we need more uniformity across our electoral practices, so that what it means to be a voter in North Carolina should not differ too much from South Carolina with respect to federal elections. right? We could think it differently for state elections, but with respect to the federal elections, should not differ. It shouldn't be that much harder for me to vote in a federal election simply because of where I live. And there are some things that will make it easier and also have uniformity across jurisdictions. And again, those things may be automatic voter registration, expanding online voter registration, which makes things easier, same day voter registration, expanding early voting, making absentee voting harder, easier. So for example, one of the things that we see in this election cycle are states like North Carolina or Pennsylvania or South Carolina that have matching requirements, signature matching requirements with respect to absentee voting. And that might make it harder. We see rates of rejection as a consequence of these types of rules, right, that make it harder for people to get their ballots counted, not because they've done anything fundamentally wrong, but because they haven't complied with a specific and particular rule. And many of those rules are actually not necessary to assure that we have a process that that works. Right? Those rules are simply imposing barriers on voters and actually making it harder for them to have their votes counted and to engage in the process. So the bottom line is, let's come up with, we already have ideas, so let's implement those ideas that make it easier for voters to participate, that makes it easier for them to cast their ballots, that equalizes the burdens among voters, so that way it's not one voter in one jurisdiction has an easier time, but the other is waiting in a very long line, right? So there are a number of different things that we can do. In addition, there are other types of great reforms that we should think about. We should try to reduce the influence of big money in our politics. So one of the reasons why some people don't participate is that they don't think that they're voting, in fact, that their ability to vote in fact counts. They think that, look, other people are big money people. They're the ones who are going to get their way. So I don't have any say in that process. So even if I show up to vote, what good is it going to do if so-and-so company or so-and-so rich individual, they're always able to get their way? So people don't participate because of the role that money plays in the process. So one suggestion is to limit the role that big money plays in our politics, to make sure that everybody who's spending money in the process, that is disclosed so that way we know, to provide better, stronger, robust public financing so that we don't depend on individuals to finance candidates, right? So that we view the running for office as a public good that is financed by the public and by the state, right? So there are a number of great ideas that are intended to reform our process, that are intended to make democratic participation more robust, that are intended to modernize our election system for the 21st century, for the first 21st century in which we find ourselves, and the demands of the 21st century in which we find ourselves. And my goal and my hope this evening was to provide you with some of the reasons why our system, we have some of the problems and issues that we have under our system, and then some suggestions of what we can do to fix them, because our democracy depends upon each of us to be vigilant, to be engaged, and to participate. Thank you. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Professor Charles, thank you so much. I have to say, first of all, that I am extremely jealous of your students and wonder if I can join your class, because I feel like so much knowledge was dropped today. I have a million questions, but I do want to turn it over to our audience first. And audience members, if you have any questions for Professor Charles, please feel free to add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will relay them. So first question comes from Jim Hollywood, and Jim says, or he asks, What would happen if we added 2 parties to North Carolina, independent and progressives, resulting in 7 parties, then switch to approval voting for the president? Other states do similar things.
Yeah, I think so. I think those are great ideas. The problem that we have is because I think of the because of the electoral college, it makes it hard to have anything other than 2 dominant parties. So I think adding more parties, switching to alternative voting mechanisms are great ideas. But I think one of the things that we will need to do at the outset is to go to a system of popular voting and get rid of our electoral college system, because I think the electoral college system makes it extremely hard to have robust national parties other than 2 dominant parties, right? So wonderful thought, but I think it requires an antecedent move, which I've talked about as getting rid of the electoral college and moving to a popular vote system.
So second question, thinking about this idea of creating reform, I'm really curious about your thoughts on what that might look like in terms of achieving it politically. So thinking about, the fact that so many of these institutional structures are really embedded in our society very deeply, thinking about, just how hard it would be to redo the Constitution, for example. What political process do you think could best precipitate that kind of reform? And I'm thinking, one, about the vote in and of itself as a mechanism for actually, leading to a change in its own system, or would it take something a little more radical like protest or, other means of engagement?
Sure, well, great question. So a couple different thoughts. Part of the issue that we have today, the fight that we're seeing in the courts, is that we're actually fighting over the rules of the game as we're playing the game. For those of you who are basketball fans, I don't know how many of you are, we're in the midst of finals and playoffs. Imagine if the rules of the game were also being contested, right? What's a foul? What is traveling? As the game is being played, where we need to pause and to ask, well, is that 3 points or is that 2 points? Right? And then let's also assume that the players get to call their foul. They get to determine whether their shot is going to count for 2 points or 3 points. Or let's assume that they get to pick, one side gets to pick the referees, right? And that the referees, so we have the Miami Heat and the Lakers, if you're following basketball. Let's assume that the referees, there are 3 of them, but 2 of them are Lakers, were appointed by the Lakers, and 1 of them was appointed by the Heat, right? I mean, how do we think the process, how the process will follow, what the legitimacy of the process? So we are fighting both about the ground rules of the game and as well as playing the game at the same time, which theoretically that is not supposed to happen. We're supposed to use the political process, and the vote they're the mechanisms by which we're supposed to use in order to make fundamental change, right? So that's the first thing that we want to think about. The second thing that I think we want to think about is the fact that there are different types of reforms, right? There are the reforms that might take constitutional amendments, and then there are different types of the reforms that might go through the legislative process. And there are reforms that might go to different parts of the legislative process. So there are reforms that might take place at the state and local level, and there are reforms that need to take place at the national level, right? So, and each of those levels raises different levels of difficulty. Obviously, the constitutional amendment is hardest, right? We have a constitution that has not been amended a lot at all, and certainly in the last few years has been extremely difficult to amend. So that So to change the fundamentals of the Constitution are really hard. It is really hard. Now, some of you may be familiar with the National Popular Vote Plan, which in some senses is a way to get around the amending the Constitution by getting the states to agree to a compact to award their electoral college votes to the winner of the national popular vote, right? So here's a a political process that tries to get around the constitutional amendment process in order to then get the type of fundamental changes that we want, right? So there are those types of possibilities. And then of course, as I mentioned, the House has already passed an important fundamental voting rights bill. And depending upon what happens this election, there might be the coalition for a rethinking of our election system and voting systems and a political participation framework that does not require constitutional amendment. Now, again, part of what we're fighting over is how the votes are going to be counted and when are they going to be counted, right? So those rules are being contested even as the election is taking place. But there are different types of reforms at different levels, and that can make fundamental change, even when the most difficult set of reforms, such as amending the Constitution, may not be attainable in the near future.
So can I tag on a question to this? So in political science, we think a lot about windows of opportunity. So these periods that come about every so often, they don't stay open, like these windows don't stay open long, but they're opportunities where lawmakers can get really revolutionary or, at the very least, bold reforms passed that they otherwise couldn't because the politics, like the stars just line up perfectly.
Yep.
Could COVID-19 and perhaps even sort of COVID with this current awakening and new racial justice movement be one of those windows that might push us a little further down the field when it comes to this kind of reform?
That's a great question. So this is exactly what we saw with respect to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We had a social movement, and particularly, Selma was determinative. It really did change the agenda, right? So even though the civil rights movement had been going all along very nicely, but Selma really did change the agenda. And then, of course, you had the politics aligning. So the Democrats were able to the northern wing of the party essentially was able to overcome the southern wing of the party. And then you also had Democrats who held the presidency. So you had a window of opportunity that then resulted in deep and fundamental change, which was the 65 Voting Rights Act, which was a very broad and radical statute in so many different ways, right? And you're right, there exists the possibility of something like that happening here. We've had the protests around a number of different sets of issues, but particularly around racial justice questions. We've had COVID-19 highlight some of the deficiencies with many parts of our process, including our political process. There seems to be some level of deep satisfaction with the current political alignment. So if one gets a wave and the strong demand, so there are issues that we're hearing today that we didn't hear before. People are taking seriously things like defunding the police, right? Whether one agrees with it or not, that's not my point. My point is that there are ideas on the table now with respect to deep and structural reform that were not on the table 6 months ago, a year ago, right? So it depends, again, what happens in the next few months. If you get a wave election and now you have consolidation by one political party, it is possible then to get the type of deep and fundamental change that spurred by the social movements, right, of the last few months, deep fundamental change that perhaps were unthinkable even a year or a year and a half, and certainly 4 years ago.
And on this reform question, we've got another one from the audience, our last question from Ed Pickert. What are your feelings about ranked choice voting?
I'm a fan of alternative voting structures, including ranked choice voting. I think, so the one place that I think about it, which is not direct to the question, but I think is quite relevant as well, when we're thinking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, when we're thinking about, what do we do with majority minority districts, right? So instead of drawing single member districts, I think we ought to be much more expansive in our thinking. So so someone earlier brought up approval voting, and now we're talking about ranked choice voting. I think all of these alternative voting systems ought to be on the table. We're seeing ranked choice voting being accepted more in the American polity than it has ever been before. I remember when I was in law school, when Lonnie Grenier was talking about cumulative voting and alternative voting systems, people branded her quota queen. Those ideas are now part of our lexicon, and some of them are part of our practices. So I personally am a fan of thinking about all sorts of alternative voting systems and trying them out. One of the benefits of our decentralized system is the ability to try out a number of different sets of ideas. And this is something that has happened with ranked choice voting, for example, tried out at various local levels, and then now really gaining some acceptance. So from an experimental perspective, I think these are all great ideas. They should all be put on the table, and we should try them out and to see what works, and not to be hidebound by the systems that we've been used to over the last few hundred years.
Well, I have to say, Professor Charles, I feel like everyone here, if we're not already in law school, we feel like we have gotten a little taste of it, and we might actually be recruited after this conversation. Thank you so
careful,
much.
they might charge tuition.
They might, and maybe we'll go online, so it'll be easier for us to work with. Oh, Professor Guy Charles is the Edward and Ellen Schwarzman Professor of Law at Duke University Law School. We are very proud to claim him as our keynote speaker for this conference. Thank you so much, Professor Charles.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. I really appreciate it.
And I'd also like to offer some final thanks from a number of our partners for being so supportive in helping us with this two-day endeavor. So a big thanks to the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, to the Heart Leadership Program, to the Jordan Institute for Families at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and to the North Carolina Scholars Strategy Network. Thank you, thank you, thank you. A huge thanks to the Polis team, to Anna Kinnear, to our amazing Polis Directors Fellows who have been backstage helping to make this the smoothest process. So I am so indebted to all of you. We hope that you will follow us on Twitter. We were live tweeting today, and we will post a number of these sessions on YouTube in the coming weeks. So we hope that you will check them out. For now, I'm Deondra Rose, and wishing you a wonderful evening. Thanks so much for being with us, everybody. Take care.